The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales radio show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me. I'm Charles Christian and with me is Janie. This is episode 38, the 18th of October edition of the Weird Tales Radio Show podcast, available on iTunes, Spotify and all the usual podcast platforms. We've our usual varied selection of stories for you, but first over to Janie, who has been looking at some of the folklore and traditions associated with today. And the 18th of October is St. Luke's Day. Now, in the UK, there's a phrase called St. Luke's Summer, which describes an unusually warm weather in autumn. However, Janie's here with some more folklore about St. Luke's Day.
Yes, St. Luke. Well, who knew? You should hear some of this about, what he kind of seemed to have, I don't know, spurned or... No, that's not the right word. Set off in motion.
Spurred off. Yes.
Spurred, that's right.
Spurred.
Yes. Now, apparently, for some reason, he used to be depicted with ox horns on his head when he was depicted, you know.
Yes.
In ancient times. But nobody quite knows why. Moving on many centuries, apparently there was a fair in Kent, in UK. There's a parish church there, and it's dedicated to Saint Luke. Mm-hmm. So apparently a very famous fair used to take place there each year, starting on the 18th of October, on the Green, and it became known as the Charlton Horn Fair. And it was notorious in the London region. See,
You used to live in Charlton, didn't you?
I did, very near, yes, sort of border with Greenwich, Charlton. I never saw anybody walking around with horns on their head at that point. Mostly they were coiled up in doorways with a can of cider and a Staffordshire Bull Terrier. Anyway, yeah, horns. Now, they were the theme of the fair back in this time. And then many people wore them or carried them. And there were stalls specialising in the items made of horn. And it wasn't just a harmless gimmick, apparently, because the horns actually represented sexual connotations.
Ooh.
Yeah. So it was also, from about the mid-15th century, a phrase, to wear the horns. And this referred to a cuckold, i.e. a man whose wife had been unfaithful to him. So then anything to do with horns was replete with opportunities for ribald humour.
An innuendo.
That sort of thing. Interestingly, they actually had a sign. People would make a sign using like their index finger and their little finger held aloft, like the sign of the devil, I suppose it was. But they held their hand up to their forehead with these fingers extended to represent, it was a gross personal insult. And there were numerous sexual slang phrases that included the word horn on this same sort of principle. This was all poor St. Luke. Must have been absolutely mortified. There is actually a little, a popular story that explains the origin of the fair, but it was also on a sexual theme. And it was that King John needed a rest while he was out hunting. And he went into a nearby mill. The miller's wife was attractive. She was home alone. So King decided to make advances, and he was just in the act of kissing her when the miller returned. He drew out his dagger and threatened to kill him. But the king granted him lordship over all the land between Charlton and the bend of the river near Rotherhithe. It's just before the tunnel there. Together with the right to hold a fair each year on the same day. So, the bend in the river actually had a popular name called Cuckold's Point. Yeah, I know. And the German traveller Paul Hentzer, who was well aware of the connection between horns and cuckoldry, noted in his book, 1598. That's the date, not the cost, by the way, on Amazon. Noted in his travels to England, 1598, that a long pole was sighted there with ram's horns affixed. So the whole thing goes on. I think it's possibly something to do with when somebody carried a pair of St. Luke's horns to open the fair. And it soon just degenerated into burlesque with a procession of characters dressed as the king, the miller, his wife, and hundreds of others wearing horns on their head. So, the fair attracted thousands of people. People were also in the habit of cross-dressing at this fair. So they really let their hair down.
They did.
Yeah. And this was an annual gathering that was really flaunted, which really flaunted its ribaldry so openly that the church and the state actually started to take notice. And I think also, obviously the horned beings, although they had sexual connotations, were actually seen as having a devilish tinge, which of course couldn't be allowed to go on.
Goodness,
No. So people started to obviously condemn from about the 18th century onwards this fair, and which apparently had got infamous for its rudeness and indecency. And indeed, Daniel Defoe described Charlton in the 1720s, so we've now gone on about 2 centuries, as a village famous, or rather infamous, for the yearly collected rabble of mad people at Horn Fair, the rudeness of which I cannot but think is such as ought to be suppressed. The mob indeed at the time take all kinds of liberties, and the women especially impudent for that day, as if it was a day that justified the giving themselves to loose a manner of indecency and immodesty, without any reproach or without suffering the censure which such behaviour would deserve. Now, how apposite is that in the current situation where women must be suppressed and are certainly not allowed to in any way enjoy themselves or be themselves or show that their sexuality, unless it is at the service of man. Stop, Jane. Stop. Oh, right, okay.
Sounds like a Friday night on the Prince of Wales Road in Norwich.
Yeah, possibly. I was thinking of a more political.
I know.
Anyway, the bad reputation apparently went on until the 19th century. It's quite amazing that the fair lasted as long as that, actually. But there was a Fairs Act of 1871, and that allowed the local authorities to basically get rid of it, which they did as soon as they could.
Yep.
However, there's a bit more about St. Luke's Day, actually, because it was actually regarded as a day for love divination.
Oh, we like love divination.
So it was one of my,
Yep.
A full description of the ceremony for the day does appear in a little book printed in 1685 called Mother Bunch's Closet Newly Broke Open, allegedly, in which Mother Bunch instructs young girls how to predict and control their matrimonial prospects. Anyway, she tells them Now, note this down, girls. You've got a pencil. Take some marigold flowers, some herb, thyme and wormwood, and then mix dry and pound them to a powder and simmer them with honey and vinegar over a slow fire. Most important. With this concoction, a girl should anoint her stomach, breast, and lips lying down and repeat these words thrice. St. Luke, be kind to me. In dreams let me my true love see. She should then go to sleep as fast as she can.
Which is easy to do when you've got honey clarted all over your body.
It's actually very similar to those on other nights. There's one on 20th January, St. Agnes Eve, which I have mentioned before.
Yep.
And it might be perhaps a literary fancy on the part of the author rather than evidence of a truly widespread tradition. But confirmation actually can be found in Act 4, Scene 1 of George Chapman's play Monsieur d'Olive, 1606.
Oh.
Which within occurs the line, St. Valentine's Day is fortunate to choose lovers, St. Luke's to choose husbands.
Oh.
And on that note, on that bombshell.
You're riding off into the sunset.
That's all I have to say about St. Luke.
With a pair of horns. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
One of the more curious characters I discuss in my book, Yorkshire's Weird Wolds Inside the Wold-Newton Triangle, is a certain William of Newburgh or Newburgh. That's up in near Coxwold in North Yorkshire. And he is a 12th century monk, writer, historian, and has the somewhat dubious distinction of introducing what we now call zombies and vampires, as well as fairies and possibly even aliens, into the English literary scene. Let's set the scene. Bridlington Priory was a very wealthy priory prior to the Reformation, and they set up a branch of it up at Newburgh. And one of the people who joined them was a 9-year-old boy, Bridlington boy, called William Parvus. And he would spend his entire life from 1136 to 1198 at Newburgh, and would subsequently become known as William of Newburgh, the father of English historical criticism. His great work was the Historia Rerum Anglicarum, or the History of English Affairs, a history of England from the Norman Conquest in 1066 up until his own death in 1198. Although this was very much history in a style that has since been mercilessly lampooned in the 20th century by Sellar and Yeatman in their classic comedy 1066 and all that, with its division of history into 103 good things and 5 bad kings. Nevertheless, William's book is still valued as a contemporary account of the reign of King Stephen, definitely a bad king, and the civil war with his cousin the Empress Maud. This chaotic era in English history went on for about 20 years, is sometimes called the Anarchy. And for those of you who watch British TV or read British historical detective novels, it is the setting for Ellis Peters' Brother Cadfael books and TV detective series. Anyway, along with an account of major military and political events of his time, William's history also includes glimpses into everyday 12th century life, beliefs and folklore. And he's one of the first English writers to recount tales of revenants. A revenant, the word is derived from the Latin revienne, meaning returning or to come back, is a visible, tangible ghost or a reanimated corpse. To the modern reader, some aspects of William's descriptions of revenants, particularly their returning to their tombs at dawn, sound suspiciously like vampires or zombies, but at the time he was writing, the primarily Eastern European legends of vampires were unknown in this country. In fact, many of the characteristics of the creature we now know as a vampire only began emerging in folk tales in the 18th century. The first mention of a vampire in the Oxford English Dictionary is not until 1734, nearly 600 years after William was writing. As for zombies, the shambling, mindless undead of today's books, TV series and horror movies has very little in common with William's tales of restless souls returning from the dead to harass their families and neighbours. So what does William have to say about these revenants? His first story tells of a woman in Buckinghamshire whose husband had recently died. The deceased returned from the dead one night and tried to climb into bed with her and, not only terrifying her on awakening, but nearly crushing her by the weight of his body. These post-mortem amorous advances continued for 3 nights, after which the revenant started making nocturnal visits to his former neighbours and other members of the family living nearby, before extending his ramblings to walks around the village in broad daylight. He thus became, wrote William, a like serious nuisance, which seems to be something of an understatement. The villagers complained to the local priest, who referred the matter to Bishop, later Saint Hugh of Lincoln, then living in London, who solved the problem by writing a letter of absolution for the deceased. The revenant's tomb was opened, the letter placed on the chest of the corpse before the grave was sealed one final time. After that, the deceased never troubled the living again. Another of William's stories is about a chaplain who worked for a noblewoman living near Melrose Abbey in Scotland. During his lifetime, he'd frequently ignored his religious duties, preferring instead to spend his days out hunting with the hounds, which possibly explains why, shortly after his death, he began appearing at the gates of Melrose Abbey, but was prevented from entering because of the abbey's sanctity. He then switched to appearing in the chambers of the noblewoman he'd served in life and started haunting her with his cries of anguish. Not too surprisingly, the noblewoman sought help from the abbey's monks, and it was agreed that one of them would stand guard over the chaplain's grave. The next night, the chaplain's corpse duly rose from the grave and immediately launched an attack on the monk. The monk responded by swinging the axe he'd fortunately brought with him and took several whacks at the revenant. This had the desired effect, as the revenant slunk back to his grave, which apparently opened to receive him and then closed around him again. The following day the monks returned to the grave to exhume the corpse and deal with it. When they uncovered the body, they noticed the slash marks of the axe and a growing pool of blood inside the casket. They then burned the corpse and the revenant was seen no more. William's third tale, located in the borders town of Berwick, is about a wealthy man, but, as it afterwards appeared, a great rogue. That's William's quote, who after his death and a Christian burial, though unworthy of it, sallied forth out of his grave by night, and was borne hither and thither, pursued by a pack of hounds with loud barking, thus striking great terror into the neighbours, and returning to his tomb before daylight. Although the locals were obviously terrified by encountering the revenant, the wiser shrewdly concluded that having this pestiferous corpse wandering the town would also spread disease and death. Finally, 10 young men, renowned for their boldness, were hired to dig up the horrible carcass while it slept during the day, cut it limb from limb, and burn it on the pyre. This solved the problem of the revenant, but it was not the end for the people of Berwick's sufferings, who subsequently were hit with an outbreak of the plague, which carried off a greater proportion of them. William suggests the plague was caused by a pestilence spread by the corpse, which actually makes the Berwick incident seem more like a zombie outbreak than a vampire infestation. William's fourth revenant tale is about a man of evil conduct who fled from York on the run from the law and took refuge in the Northumbrian village of Alwick. There he married a local woman much younger than himself. Suspecting, correctly as it happened, she might be having an affair with a local youth, one night he hid in the rafters of her bedroom in the hope of catching them together. He did, but unfortunately he accidentally fell through the ceiling, hitting the floor so hard he was mortally wounded and died a few days later. Then the troll began, for within a few days of his funeral there were reports of his corpse being seen wandering the streets of Alnwick, followed soon after by a fatal outbreak of plague, which everyone attributed to the pestilence being spread by the revenant. As the death toll from the plague began to rise, 2 young men resolved to rid the village of the revenant and dug up the corpse in the cemetery. They found the corpse swollen to an enormous corpulence, with its countenance beyond measure suffused with blood, and its shroud torn to pieces. Spurred on by wrath, I'm quoting again, one of the men hacked at the corpse with a spade, out of which incontinently flowed such a stream of blood that it might have been taken for a leech with the blood of many persons. They dragged the corpse beyond the village, hacked open the side of the corpse with a blunt spade, then one of them pulled out the revenant's heart, tore it to pieces, then tossed it and the rest of the corpse onto a hastily built funeral pyre. They burned the corpse, after which Alnwick was no longer troubled by either the revenant or the plague. In contrast with the Berwick story, the Alnwick tale does sound more like a traditional vampire story. William of Newburgh goes on to explain, "It would not be easy to believe that such corpses of the dead should sally, I know not why, by what agency, from their graves, and should wander about to the terror or destruction of the living, and again return to the tomb, which of its own accord spontaneously opened to receive them. Did not frequent examples occur in our own times suffice to establish this fact, to the truth of which there is abundant testimony?" In other words, he's not telling tales, he's reporting other people's accounts. He adds that his reports of these cases are a warning to posterity, and says the stories were so common that, were I to write down all the instances of this kind which I have ascertained to have befallen in our times, the undertaking would be beyond measure, laborious and troublesome. So was England plagued by the walking dead in the 12th century? William quite clearly says yes, and it's certainly true anyone living during those troubled times would have been familiar with the sight of rotting unburied corpses littering the town and countryside in the wake of the Civil War, as well as frequent outbreaks of famine and pestilence. However, let's look at another of William's stories, and this, as he puts it, involves the mysterious, wondrous occurrence, a strange and prodigious event, and concerns the green children from St. Martin's Land. The location is Woolpit in Suffolk, where one day at harvest time, during the reign of King Stephen again, 2 strange children, a brother and his sister, were discovered beside one of the wolf pits, from which the village name is derived. They looked like normal children, except they spoke an unknown language nobody could understand. They could only eat raw beans, and their skin was green. Woolpit, incidentally, is located on a ley line. The boy was sickly and soon died, but the girl, subsequently baptised as Agnes, adapted to eating other food, lost her green colour, and eventually married a lawyer from King's Lynn. You might say a lawyer deserved to be married to a green possible alien. She also mastered speaking English and explained that she and her brother came from a place called St. Martin's Land, where the sun never shone and everything was green. According to St. Agnes, the children had been herding their father's cattle when they were attracted by a loud noise, which William of Newburgh says was the ringing of the church bells in nearby Bury St. Edmunds. They followed the sound and eventually found themselves coming out into our world near the old wolf pit. Although William offers no explanation for this event, it's interesting that his story is corroborated by another contemporary writer, Ralph of Coggeshall, the abbot of a monastery located just south of Woolpit. So who were these green children? One suggestion is that it's just a garbled folk tale, while a more historical explanation is that they were the orphaned children of Flemish immigrants. A large number of Flemings were killed at the nearby Battle of Fornham in 1173, and their green skin colour was the result of either arsenic poisoning or a dietary deficiency called chlorosis. There are other explanations, including that they were extraterrestrial aliens, which would make them the first little green men ever recorded on this planet, while another suggestion is they were two inhabitants who had strayed from the fairy otherworld that exists underground and parallel to our own world. As a historian, William prided himself on his accuracy and believed they were based on reliable sources, unlike his near contemporary Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote the first accounts of King Arthur, of whom William slightingly says, "Only a person ignorant of ancient history would have any doubt about how shamelessly and impudently he, Geoffrey, lies in almost everything." That said, William nevertheless has the dubious distinction of introducing the English people to what we now call zombies and vampires, as well as fairies, and possibly even aliens.
Something wicked this way comes. Weird Harvest Press presents Harvest Hymns, the sweet fruits and twisted roots of folk horror, a 2-volume set of books investigating the music of folk horror, featuring contributions from some of the biggest names in the field: Candia McCormack, Johnny Trunk, Maddie Pryor, Sharon Krause, Jim Jupp and Kemper Norton, to name just a few. Available now via lulu.com. 100% of all Weird Harvest Press profits are donated to wildlife charities.
Welcome, fool. You have come of your own free will to the appointed place. It is time to keep your appointment with the Wicker Man. The Wicker Man.
I'm currently acting as a presenter for a radio station in Great Yarmouth on the east coast of England. Don't worry, people, it's nothing to do with the paranormal or weird tales. It's a music station, and I'm focusing purely on presenting music shows. However, it has meant I've been going over to Yarmouth on a more frequent basis, and in my spare time having a chance to poke around the town and see what I can find. And now, one of the things that intrigued me was the name of one of the little streets there. It's called the Kitty Witches Row, which is spelt as in witchcraft witches. Now, with the rows, let's just put the background in there. When Yarmouth first developed in the Middle Ages, it was essentially on a sandspit between the mouth of the River Yar, where its name comes from, and the North Sea. There were city walls around it, but it essentially meant it was a very long, narrow town with lots of narrow streets running parallel to each other across the sandbar. These streets were called rows, and there were 145 of them. In fact, many of them were only given the number. So you lived in number 44 row or number 122 row. And when I say narrow, they were, in some instances, just 27 inches wide in parts. Charles Dickens, who wrote David Copperfield, which is based in Yarmouth and knew the area, described them saying, "A row is a long, narrow lane or alley, quite straight or nearly as may be, with houses on each side, both of which you can sometimes touch at once with the fingertips of each hand by stretching out your arms to the full extent." And I'd say these streets remained, or rows remained, pretty much the same for the best part of 600 years until the 19th century, when the town started to expand in other areas and were no longer restricted to it. But why is this particular row called the Kitty Witches Row? Now, one suggestion is that Kitty Witches was a local name for the swimming crabs that were found in the nearby Breydon Water. This is the large, almost like a lake, at the mouth of the River Yar on one side of Yarmouth. And the idea being that the rows were so narrow it was easier to enter them sideways like a crab. Nice idea. Another suggestion is that there was a flying beetle called the cockchafer, which was known in this part of Norfolk as a kittiwitch. There's also suggestion it related to a type of seabird, that there was a female spectre dressed in white that used to haunt it, and that it was derived from the Dutch word kittiwidge, meaning house of bad repute. And why would the Dutch be saying that? Well, Great Yarmouth is just across the North Sea from Holland, and it used to, in medieval times and until much later, used to have an annual herring fair which ran from Michaelmas, September the 29th, through to Martinmas, November the 11th, and large numbers of Dutchmen would come over and frequent the houses of bad repute. There's another story here by the Reverend Robert Forby, and writing some years before his death in 1830, he said it was home to the kittiwitches, who were women of ill repute who would terrorise residents in order to fund their drinking sessions. He wrote that a kittiwitch was a woman dressed in a grotesque and frightful manner, otherwise called a kittiwitch, probably for the sake of a jingle. I don't get that bit, I must admit. It was customary many years ago for Yarmouth women of the lowest order to go in troops from house to house to demand contributions at some season of the year to support their drinking. And they would wear men's shirts over their own clothing, and their faces would be smeared with mud and blood. And the Reverend Forby goes on to say, these hideous beldams have long discontinued their perambulations, but in memory of them, one of the many rows in that town was called Kittiwitch Row. Another, far less exciting explanation is the row was named after a former resident who was a baker there. His name was Christopher Witch, spelt W-Y-C-H-E, so pronounced witch, and Christopher, as you probably know, is frequently shortened to Kit. So Kit Witch's Row, Kitty Witch Row. Oh dear. No witches on broomsticks then. Shame. That's it. We're almost out of time, so Janie and I look forward to joining you again next week. But until then, the nights are growing darker, they're darker now than sin. So may your gods and goddesses protect you from ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties and things that go bump in the night. Good night.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon. Which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your fortnightly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, magic and folklore. Keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com or by email at urbanfantasist@icloud.com and on Twitter at Christian Uncut. Good night. Join us again in 2 weeks' time for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show.